Welcome to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available in podcast form. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, the Hijacking of American Christianity. Ladies and gentlemen, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. Well, it's no secret that Americans love conspiracy theories. They have been part of our political landscape from the beginning, but more recently there has circulated a number of these so-called conspiracies that now seem poised to take down our very democracy itself. What is different about these new conspiracy theories, and is there a way that we can combat them as individuals and as a nation? Well, we are very fortunate to have as our guest tonight Dr. Russell Muirhead, who is the Robert Clements Professor of Democracy and Politics at Dartmouth College, New Hampshire, and the author of The Promised Party in a Polarized Age, among other books. And also we have with us Dr. Nancy L. Rosenblum, who is the Senator Joseph Clark Research Professor Emerita of Ethics in Politics and Government at Harvard University. And her books include Good Neighbors, The Democracy of Everyday Life in America. And together, they are the co-authors of A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy, published by Princeton University Press, my alma mater. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thanks for making the time to talk about your very timely and informative book in which you raise some very, very disturbing issues. And first, I want to talk about conspiracy theories in general. If I may, they've always been part of our history, as I mentioned. What is it about Americans that we seem to love to imagine conspiracies? We seem to love these conspiracy theories. Dr. Rosenblum, I'll start with you, and Dr. Muirhead, feel free to chime in.
I just begin by saying that it's not only Americans who like conspiracy theories, that as long as there have been politics, there have been counts of conspiracy, which is to say that some nefarious force is acting covertly against you or yours, your nation, or whatever. So they're everywhere, and people have talked about what are the conditions for conspiracy theory, but they're almost always with us. And the question for our book and for Americans today is, why is it that a certain kind of conspiracism has really taken over public life? I just say one more thing by way of introduction, which is that conspiracy theories are sometimes true. It's important to acknowledge that. Sometimes the evidence used is warranted, and sometimes it's completely absurd. But some conspiracy theories are true, and some conspiracy theories are even progressive and have helped democracy. And we can talk about that later on if you like.
Okay, great. We will. Thank you. Now, the title of your book, a lot of people are saying, I don't think it's a mystery where that comes from.
Yes.
In fact, the phrase was in the news last week. I'm sure you heard it when President Biden's press secretary Jen Psaki confronted a reporter from a right-wing. Well, I think I got it the first time. The right-wing news agency who used that expression. A lot of people are saying this, and Jen Psaki sort of shot back, well, who is saying this in particular? Can you name someone specifically? And of course, the reporter couldn't, and ended up abandoning her question. But Dr. Muirhead, I'll address this to you. Can you talk about the title of your book, where it comes from, and how did this book all come together? How did you begin to work together and decide that this was the time to write this book?
The title essay, comes, of course, from the signature phrase that Donald Trump used over and over again when he repeated some conspiratorial charge or another. Well, a lot of people are saying, he would say. And it really gets at something different about the conspiracism that's come to wrap itself right around American politics in the past 4 or 5 years, which is that this kind of conspiratorial thinking gets its power from repetition. a lot of people say it. If a lot of people are saying it, then it must be okay for me to forward it or retweet it or say it one more time. And that logic of repetition both makes conspiratorial charges more powerful and it lowers the bar. People don't ask themselves, is it true? Do I believe it? They just say, hey, is it okay to repeat? A lot of people are saying it must be okay to repeat. And so that's a key mechanism in this kind of conspiracism that's really dogging American democracy right now. And Nancy and I, we're trying to make sense of this phenomenon. We're students of democracy, and we're aware that, conspiratorial thinking has always been with democracy. Some people say that the Declaration of Independence itself is a conspiracy theory. As Nancy just said, we appreciate that many times conspiracy theories are true. And at their best, they're a lot like investigative journalism. They engage in very serious efforts to gather evidence, and they try to connect the dots, and they try to make the workings of power readable to democratic citizens. But we saw before us, starting in the 2016 campaign, some really weird stuff happening. And one example of that might be Pizzagate. And this is the story according to which Hillary Clinton was running a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a Washington, D.C. pizzeria. It's a really weird story. It doesn't explain anything about the world. It doesn't try to make sense of any event like, say, the Kennedy assassination or the 9/11 attacks on the United States. It's just this sort of free-floating bit of fiction. And it's on its face kind of laughable and preposterous, except for the fact that it gets repeated over and over and over, and people take it seriously. And in fact, after it got going right before the election, right after the election, a man named Edgar Welsh shows up at this pizzeria with an assault rifle that he fires in an effort to, as he said, self-investigate the charge. So we're trying to make sense of this as something really different. That's what got us into this.
Can I answer this question too? About
sure.
the origin story of our interest of this book. For me, and I think for Russ as well, correct me, Russ, if this isn't true, sometimes something happens and you're startled into thought. And what happened for me, I think for us, is the day after Donald Trump's inauguration as president, where he had been bragging throughout the election and after that he had the largest inaugural crowds in all of history, larger than in Obama's, and so on and so forth. And the next day, the National Park Service issued, as they always do, photographs of the scene at the National Mall for the inauguration, and it showed a rather modest crowd. And Trump's initial reaction, his instinctive reaction, was those photographs were doctored. And there was a certain absurdity in this claim. What are the civil servant photographers in the National Park Service doctoring the photos in order to get at him? And I think that for us, this was an alert, a warning. We knew that Trump had been a conspiracist. He was part of the birther conspiracy, that it was a kind of mindset that he naturally had. But we were put on warning that this was going to be a central aspect of his administration, and it raised for us from the very start two questions. One was that this was going to be a debate about who owns reality. Who owns reality? What is the evidence? What is the thinking that's going to make something real and believable for us? And the other question was, what are its political consequences? Because it became apparent to us very early on, really right after the doctored photograph claim, that this kind of conspiracism was going to degrade institutions in a way that other kinds of conspiracy don't.
Mm. When you both were talking about repeating the lie, I just reminded of Joseph Goebbels' theory about die große Lüge, the big lie. If it's big enough, unbelievable enough, and yet repeated constantly, it will become truth. People will accept it as truth. It's a pretty scary connection there.
It is, but
Yeah,
it's only after 4 years that we've had what we're now calling the big lie. What we had before that were thousands and thousands of lies, many of which took the form of conspiracy charges. And the consequence of these conspiracy charges on democratic institutions and on, who's owning reality is what we tried to trace and what we're living with now.
Now, you call this phenomenon the new conspiracism. First, what conspiracy theories are we talking about specifically? If you could mention a couple of them. I know there are many. And what is new about these conspiracy theories that makes them so dangerous?
A couple examples. Birtherism is an example. The idea that people conspired to install someone who wasn't constitutionally eligible to serve as president in the office of the presidency, namely Barack Obama, and they conspired to lie about the fact that he wasn't constitutionally eligible because he was allegedly born outside of the United States. Pizzagate, this really strange story that I just mentioned, which didn't go away after the election of 2016 when Hillary Clinton did go away. The story didn't go away. It metastasized into QAnon. And QAnon is a kind of mashup of several, of a whole bunch of charges, but at the core of it is the idea that Donald Trump was secretly investigating a whole raft of liberal globalists, including Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, George Soros, and many, many others, for their treasonous activity, and was preparing to indict them and imprison them. And the rigged election conspiracy, which Nancy just alluded to, which first was floated by Donald Trump in the summer of 2016, I think. And it, it started as a very little lie. And it started about the election of 2016. He said, I have some, this election, there's signs that bad things are going on in this election, he said, when he was behind Hillary Clinton in the polls in the summertime. And so those are some examples. And the thing that all of these conspiratorial conjectures and charges have in common is they don't start with anything real in the world. Classic conspiracy theories start with something in the world that's really hard to understand, really hard to explain. For instance, as I said, like the idea that one person killed the most protected person on earth, the President of the United States. How could that happen? Or that 19, roughly speaking, Saudi dissidents conspiring with very few resources from the sands of Afghanistan could succeed at attacking the United States of America and the Pentagon, Washington, D.C., for the first time since 1812. This was really weird, and people said, why? Why us? Who did it? How do we make sense of this? And for that matter, even the response, the invasion of Iraq, did not make sense to many people. And when something really fundamental like that doesn't make sense, sometimes it's an economic event, a recession that throws many millions of people out of work, that's hard to understand and hard to make sense of and vitally important for the fate of our world, people will reach for an explanation. And one kind of explanation that they usually reach for is a conspiratorial one that makes sense of things. So that's what classic conspiracy theory does. And as I said, it works by not just telling a story like a piece of fiction. It works by gathering evidence. Often they're really vexing. These classic conspiracy theories are really frustrating because they're kind of self-sealed systems from which there's no exit once you get inside them, and they're really badly flawed. Sometimes they're true, and when people argued that the CIA was experimenting with efforts to control people's minds by giving people psychedelic drugs without them knowing, that sounds preposterous, but it turned out to be true. And there are lots of other stories that you can't maybe believe at first sight that turn out to be true. Classic conspiracy theory starts with something in the world, gathers evidence, and tries to unmask the workings of power for the sake of restoring democracy. and putting the people back in charge. This stuff that we, are trying to understand, the conspiracism of recent years, doesn't start with anything real. It doesn't gather evidence. It doesn't connect the dots. It doesn't make sense of the world. It makes the world much, much weirder. And it doesn't restore democracy. It undermines it. So it's really, from birtherism to the rigged election conspiracies, really different.
Mm. I'm just speaking. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's exactly right. And let me give another set of examples to underscore Russ's explanation. If you look at conspiracy theories that we think are true, the way in which people have looked at how the tobacco companies tried to distort and undermine the evidence for the relationship between tobacco and lung cancer, for example, or the same thing that was done with Exxon and the fossil fuel companies, how they were misleading. They knew the evidence of climate change, but were misleading people about it in order to maintain their profits. I mean, this is classic conspiracy theory at work, finding how the channels of power operate. By contrast, look at what's happened with COVID. I mean, this was a real event, a pandemic. And people managed to make it seem as if COVID, or at least a response to COVID, was being perpetrated by Democrats in order to thwart President Trump's re-election. I mean, that's an extraordinary reach, right, in order to try to put something together. And it's without any evidence, right? Without any evidence, it's simply by repeating it over and over and over.
Yeah, I'm speaking as a pastor now. In the past, we would normally have in our churches one or two individuals who were into conspiracy theories, and they would talk about them wildly at church. But they were people who were on the fringe of the church socially, I guess you would say, often with some kind of mental illness. And, they were just extra grace required people, and you just loved on them and blessed them, and it wasn't a big problem. But today, and I talked to many pastors who say, half of my people, half of my congregation believe these things or more, and there are even people on my leadership boards who believe them as well, and it's really, really difficult to deprogram people from the pulpit. It just seems like no amount of scripture that I throw out there seems adequate, to challenge what people believe now is true. And a lot of pastors are growing frustrated and feeling burned out. It's a scary situation. How did we get here? I mean, what? I know that's a big question.
That's such a good question, isn't it, Nancy?
It is a good question. I think, let me just pick up first on a phrase that you used about pastors thinking about how you deprogram your congregants. And that phrase, deprogram, is interesting because it's used clinically in psychology about people who join cults. Mm-hmm. And you're using it appropriately. I mean, Trumpism and the group of people around these political conspiracy claims today have aspects of a cult. That is, it's become part of their identity. They feel they're a we at war with the rest of the world, withdrawn and in their own media and other environments. And it's most obviously partisan, but it's not your usual aggressive partisanship. It really does see the opposition as an enemy, which cults do. They see the outside as threatening. So I think there are cultish aspects to the conspiracism today. If you think of Trump's rally, where people would repeat slogans or lock her up, or other kinds of slogans, it's this kind of claim and response. There was a kind of not I wouldn't say irrational, but collective aspect to it, of us against them in a very real way. And and you ask why now. I mean, there are many conditions that made that happen. As I said before, this is a big business. There are entrepreneurs doing it. There's now a whole set of media that do it, and it is partisan. So, and in an era already of party polarization, being a we that's connected to an organized party has definite appeal. It allows for aggressiveness in a way that it wouldn't ordinarily.
Maybe talk about that you mentioned the partisan connection in your book, the partisan connection that sort of undergirds or gives strength and speed to these conspiracy theories. Could you talk about that, Dr. Muirhead?
Nancy and I, when we first started encountering these, we thought that elected officials would actually correct some of the misunderstandings that conspiracy entrepreneurs, which from the sort of margins of the information ecosystem, were spreading. And we expected elected officials who are kind of trusted by the people who vote for them, by their fellow partisans, to speak truth to conspiracy. We thought that elected officials would follow the example of the late Senator McCain, who, when he was having a town hall in the 2008 election, encountered a woman who began to refer to Barack Obama as someone who was, born outside the United States. He said, excuse me, ma'am, no, ma'am, I got to say, he's an American, he's a good American, he's a family man. He and I have some very serious policy disagreements. That's what this election is about. And he just interrupted her, wouldn't even let it get spoken, and spoke truth to the conspiracy. 2015, Nancy and I thought that the partisan connection would be a source of truth, that it would help right our politics. And I have to say, we didn't get that right. We were really surprised when, during the Trump administration, we expected the Republican Party people in the Republican Party to behave in the manner of Elizabeth Cheney. And we thought that they would speak truth to conspiracy, even if they were just as conservative as the most conservative Republican you could ever imagine. We thought conservatism doesn't need this stuff in order to be powerful, in order to persuade people, in order to elect people. So we figured that conservatives would stand up to it. There was a conspiracy that we caught on to when we were first writing about this called Jade Helm. I think it's summer of 2015. There was a military training exercise that was going to happen in southwestern states. And there was a conspiratorial idea that got going in Texas, which was that the military was planning to take over Texas. The U.S. Army was planning to declare martial law in Texas and confiscate people's guns. And then Governor Abbott, instead of saying this is not true, it's wrong, it's preposterous, instead of that, he put the state's National Guard on high alert and charged it with defending the basic constitutional rights of Texans in the event that the U.S. Army went awry. So it turns out that, public officials followed the Abbott model and not the Cheney model. And the partisan connection is now a source of real distortion, what you could call epistemic distortion. It's distorting people's understandings. And it's probably the number one source of the stolen election conspiracy. The idea that the presidential election of 2020 was stolen. And it's why I think, probably the majority of Republicans believe in the stolen election conspiracy today, because that's what they're being told by the elected officials they trust.
You also mention in your book, and this is for Dr. Rosenblum, the role of gatekeepers in the past that helped correct certain fallacies that crept into the news. What has happened to that role of gatekeeper with the advent, especially of the internet, I suppose?
Right. Well, it's disappeared in terms of media and social media in particular. It's also that as anybody can post anything, anywhere, immediately and at no cost. And right now, as we know, Facebook and Twitter are being faced with some questions about how they ought and whether they ought to be the regulators of what happens, the gatekeepers. So that's one obvious and probably the most important absence of gatekeepers. But there's another thing going on, or two or three other things going on that I would mention about gatekeepers. One is that this conspiracism has successfully attacked expertise and specialized knowledge. So whereas in the past, professionals of various kinds or civil servants of various kinds or people in the post office who know how the post office works would speak out, now either they are intimidated from speaking out because they'll lose their jobs, or even if they do speak out, the suggestion is that they're just part of the conspiracy, right? That they have no particular knowledge that's worth listening to. I mean, in the same way that the Republican conspiracism has undone mainstream media by saying the mainstream media is just a hoax, right, from day one. The same thing has been said about people who tried to correct things that they know about in detail through specialized knowledge. So I think there's been a sort of confluence of things that have neutralized the usual forces that would be out there and to some extent listened to. It would have some authority, and they no longer do. That is, the authority of all kinds of knowledge-producing institutions has been delegitimated.
Now, you talk in your book about this new conspiracism being politically sterile in terms of being destabilizing, degrading, I'm quoting, deconstructing, delegitimizing without a countervailing constructive impulse. In other words, it destroys without building. It doesn't offer any alternative. Dr. Muirhead, could you talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, as I was saying, classic conspiracy theory tried to disempower elites who were betraying the people, but always for the sake of something, for the sake of building democratic institutions, of restoring democracy. And so there was always behind the critical project a constructive vision. And you could say it was conspiracy theory in two ways. It was a theory of explanation, but also kind of a theory about how things should be and how democracy should go. And the conspiracism that's really almost defined American politics for the last 5 years, we don't see that. We don't see that conception of how the bureaucracy would look if it weren't tainted by conspiracy, or how elections would look, or what the Democratic Party would look like if it didn't have a child sex trafficker running, as its nominee. So there's no idea of a healthy democracy or a healthy political community that stands behind it. It's a very, very, it's a uniquely acidic force.
Yeah, it's grievance and aggression without constructive policy, and that's why you'll read in the news quite a bit today that the Republican Party in the United States is no longer a governing party. That is, they have ambitions for themselves, sometimes corrupt ones and sometimes just power, but they don't have constructive policies that they want to pursue. And I think where you saw this most dramatically, obviously, was in the insurrection, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, where the attempt was to stop an election. But then what? Right? But then what? Trump said, if Biden is inaugurated, he can't be considered president. We're going to refer to him as the presidential occupant. But there was no sense of what, after blocking the certification of the election results, would happen.
Yeah. What if they had stopped the count?
Right. Exactly. That's the point. Then Trump would be back in power, presumably, and then what?
The irony, of course, is that the peddling of these conspiracy theories would seem itself to be a conspiracy, and that begs the question, cui bono, who's benefiting from this? And I have to say, just personally, I would be enormously relieved if the government, came out tomorrow and said, we've found that Russia is behind all of these, destabilizing conspiracy theories. That would be a very simple explanation, but reading your book, I understand, that the explanation is much more complicated. It's more of a phenomenon than just a conspiracy.
Yeah, there's no central, authority that's behind it, and in many ways, I think the entrepreneurs who invent conspiratorial notions are many, and they're not really at the center of politics, but their voices are amplified, as Nancy said, by an information ecosystem in which anyone can post anything. And if what they say happens to benefit now a party or a person who's aspiring for power, then it's going to get repeated now by people in the mainstream of politics. So the big difference is that conspiracism has moved from the periphery. As you described, it was in the periphery in your pews. It was only once in a while sort of congregant who was in the grips of a kind of conspiracy theory, and now it's mainstream, and it's coming from the very center of politics, from political officials who large numbers, millions of people trust, and that's made it much more difficult to deal with.
Right. What we have to ask this question, and your book does address this too, I think in a very hopeful way. What are we to do? It doesn't seem that our government is able to do much. What can we do as individuals and as a nation? What's the role of government? What's the role of the citizenry in combating this? And are you hopeful about the future? Dr. Rosenblum.
You give me the hard one.
Oh, you can share it.
I
was hoping he would ask you, Nancy.
I give one pass.
What to do? Let me say 3 or 4 things about this. The first thing that you do, and that has been done, and it's now being done much more forcefully, is to speak truth to conspiracism. This is something that Russ brought up earlier. And you speak truth not particularly with the motivation of altering the views of those who are committed conspiracists, but of bolstering the rest of us, right? Of sort of removing some of the disorientation that people feel with this absurdity about reality going on around us, and saying, yes, we're all in this together, and here are facts, and here's information, and here's how our normal modes of reasoning are once again back in politics, and so on and so forth. So speaking truth is important, and allowing, as I said, various kinds of professionals and civil servants and so on to speak out once again it bolsters the rest of us, although I don't think it changes the minds of conspiracists. I also think that I'm an advocate of the significance of civil society groups and associations, including churches, obviously, in American democracy in particular. And I think that you have seen over the years now a real development of all kinds of organized groups speaking out to their own people. And this has been important. I think the Black Lives Matter movement, which is the biggest social movement ever in the United States, I believe, and has organized and is around litigation and is pushing back not only for their own purposes of criminal justice, but in general against the forces of conspiracism. The problem, as I see it, and I don't know if I'm hopeful, to tell you the truth, is that I really did suspect that when Trump was out of the picture, and hoped that he would be out of the picture, there would be the Republicans would feel free to come around, or at least a large number of them would feel free to come around. You can't have a functioning democracy, a functioning two-party system, when one of the parties is committed. At this point, they're committed for cynical reasons. That is, the Republican base, as they see it, is so tied to Trump and to this way of thinking that if they don't go along, they'll all lose their seats. But it is cynical and self-serving, and they seem to be committed to it. How long this will be true, I don't know, but certainly for the next foreseeable cycles of elections. And once that's the case, once you have one of our two major parties, and not only in the federal government, but even more so in many of the states and state legislatures, and changing that through elections is a very long-term thing. The Democratic Party has unfortunately never put its sights on state government and state legislatures, although it is now. So it really is still there at the center of public life, and it has its adherents who are more and more committed to it, and we've seen that it has resulted in violence. I don't think we've seen the last of that either. So I guess I'm not too hopeful, at least in the short run. But I do think that a change of administration and the ability of people to speak out is heartening for those of us who find this question of who owns reality just a very disorienting question.
Mm. You had mentioned...
when we were...
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So, when Nancy and I were finishing our book, we kind of thought that the whole phenomenon might just go away, that it might go back to the periphery, and that our book might come out, and right when it came out, people look at us and say, "What were you talking about? Conspiracism." and it didn't happen that way. I mean, when we were finishing the book, we were just following the logic of this stuff to its conclusion. We didn't know what would happen in the world, but we followed the logic, and we followed it to a scenario in which a president who loses an election won't concede and says that the election was rigged and won't leave. And we write about this at the end of our book. We didn't necessarily think that would happen or come to pass. We on the contrary, we thought it might not happen at all, and then it did happen in 2020. And I guess I still sort of imagine that it might just go back to the citizenry and our officials, may just recover their common sense. Without common sense, democracy can't work. And I have to believe, I am optimistic about the resilience of common sense. On the other hand, more than ever, we need to speak up for common sense in both a wholesale way and just in a face-to-face way. More and more, people we know, people we encounter, people we talk to, friends, are in the grips of some of these conspiratorial ideas. And more, I think we need to speak truth to these in a calm, evidentiary, and friendly, even loving way. And we need to say, really, do you think the election was stolen? I sometimes will ask people questions. Do you think that all the Republicans who were elected in 2020 were elected in fraudulent elections? And, they'll say, well, no, it's just the Democrats. Well, that doesn't make much sense that just Democrats could be elected by fraud, but no Republicans could be elected by fraud. And that, even just a question like that inserts a little bit of doubt. Again, I'm not trying to beat somebody in a knockdown, drag-out debate that's really kind of nasty and unfriendly, just trying to insert a question that introduces a tiny little bit of doubt. And I think the other thing that we need to recover is we need to remember that it's possible to oppose people in politics without thinking that they're evil. It's possible to oppose Hillary Clinton or a liberal or whatever, or Joe Biden, without telling a story about them being evil. You can just oppose them because you think they're wrong. And that's enough. We don't need to imagine Hillary Clinton as a child sex trafficker. You can just think you don't like her tax policies or her social policy or her court policies for the court. And we need to remember that there's plenty of good reasons to oppose people in politics without making up these things.
Well, that's one of the reasons for pessimism, I think, which is that we have had things that are very difficult to reverse. One is the demonization of political opposition. And you can't have a democracy without a notion that the opposition is a legitimate opposition. And the notion that there will be another election, and the other election you may win, but that you don't try to exile them or lock them up or demonize them, so that the notion that if they win an election, they're illegitimate rulers. I think that this demonization becomes very, very entrenched. And so has something else, which is what we discuss as the delegitimation of political institutions. That is, for many Americans now, and it happened long before, it's been happening for quite a while if you look at the social science data on this, that the value of democracy for people has gotten smaller and smaller, less and less in all kinds of areas. And so there's a sense in which the terrain was ripe ripe for this delegitimation of institutions as well as just political opposition. And I do think that the only way to re-legitimate institutions, by which I mean that they would have meaning, that they would have value, and that they would have authority for people, would be to show that they work. They show that they work. And that's why a lot of people who aren't particularly even Democrats or Bidenites are hopeful that a government that is delivering goods for people, acting in the public interest, and successfully and efficiently meeting needs of some kind, even if it's just in the short run, is so important, because it's an answer to a very general temper of thinking that democracy doesn't work and has no value.
Mm. Just one last question. We'll leave it at that. Part of the solution, you say in your book, is something that you call enacting democracy. What do you mean by that? And this is for both of you. And what is the role of enacting democracy in the solution?
You want to start, Nancy?
Yeah, I think that in a simple way, enacting democracy is just what I was talking about a moment ago, which is that you go through regular procedures, you collect information and facts, you make arguments, you legislate, you have a bureaucracy that tries to operationalize things, that the whole business of government or governance it can never be perfectly transparent, but is going along through laws and procedures, and that not only is it happening that way, that the people who are governing are talking about it as they do it, so that you see it literally happening in front of you. And I think that President Biden has been making an effort to do exactly that. Here's how we develop these policies. Here's how we think they're going to work. Here's how we're making sure that the checks come out to you in an efficient way, and so on and so forth. It is an attempt to talk about the steps that are being taken, to show that they're being taken in what they at least think is the public interest, and with some degree of transparency. And I think that that's the only way, the delivery of goods in the public interest, to begin to hack away at the level of distrust and delegitimation that we've seen.
And I think that there's this huge thing. It's called a constitution that stands between the sovereign people and the authority of democratic laws. So for the sovereign people to authorize a democratic law, it has to follow a certain, as Nancy said, process. And we learn like the 8th grade, school book version of that in civics, where we learn about a bill becoming a law. There's a lot more to governance than just, getting a majority in the House and the Senate and the President's signature. There are settled processes for forming rules and for administering government. And a great example of this is the Electoral College and the way that Electoral College votes are received by the Senate and are counted in a joint session. And this is the thing that Trump tried to interrupt on January 6th. He thought that his vice president could go there and interrupt this process, and they could impose just by will the answer that they thought was right. But one person imposing his will is not what constitutional democracy is all about. So I think enacting democracy means now explaining the processes that make democracy constitutional and standing up for those processes so that people don't think it's just that democracy is just about imposing your way when you have a majority.
Mm. Just one more minute. Dr. Rosenblum, do you have anything that you want to add?
Well, I would say that we've seen a really hopeful enactment of democracy by citizens since the last election and even a little bit before. That is, we've never had so many citizens come out to vote under very trying circumstances, including this pandemic. And it shows, I think, a reinvigorated interest in participation. And, ultimately the checks on democracy, on democratic governments, are going to come from below. They're going to come from the people, organized, not necessarily even into parties, but organized into various kinds of interest groups and civil society groups. And we've seen, I believe, a flourishing of that. So at the same time that we've had the delegitimation of certain structures and institutions, we've had really exhilarating responsiveness on the part of citizens.
Mm. Do you believe that our Constitution is going to hold against this?
I have to tell you, actually, I am optimistic. I think that sometimes it helps to describe what we're up against in order to, fortify people's common sense and amplify their resolve. So I think that's ultimately what Nancy and I are trying to do. I don't know if my optimism is warranted, but I do think it will hold, yes.
Well, Dr. Russell Muirhead and Dr. Nancy Rosenblum, they're authors of A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy, published by Princeton University Press. It's available, I guess, on Amazon and other big book retailers.
It's so easy to get, SJ. It's so easy to get.
That's good to hear.
And there's an audio book for people who don't want to read.
Okay, that's great.
Like me.
Listen while you drive.
Right.
So run out and get that book, either on audio or it's on Kindle as well, right? And ebook. So thank you both for coming. A very interesting discussion, and we appreciate it. And this is Pastor S.J. Munson wishing you a good evening and signing out.